Overall, life in the North for most of the population was very difficult. While husbands, fathers, and brothers were off to war, women were forced to take their place on the farms, in the factories, stores, and in the government offices. Women contributed to the war effort by supplying the troops with clothes and blankets, and by supervising sanitary programs, as well as working in factories manufacturing weapons and ammunition.
Ladies, I wish to thank you for letting me address you this afternoon. I need to speak to you on a matter of most importance. I am associated with the Sanitary Commission out of New York. Now, I know the war has been going on and we have given a lot of ourselves, but we need to give more.
Though deeply concerned over the plight of their native state, most Southern women focused on the challenges the war placed upon their families and homes. 3 words sum up the Southern home: shortage, substitute, and sacrifice. Food shortages were the fault of the severely damaged railroad systems. Farmers could not transport the food quickly enough to the people without having it spoil. Women who lived on farms had to do everything, plus plant and harvest their own crops. The effects of the naval blockade forced women to invent substitutes for products located outside of the South. For sugar, thinned molasses was substituted. Crushed corn or dried sweet potato replaced coffee. Often during the war, the soldiers' families had no income to support themselves. The lack of supplies, worthless Confederate money, and shortage of medicine caused many hardships. Many families were made homeless as they escaped from the terrors of the enemy ransacking, destroying, and burning their homes. For the South, each year brought more death and destruction. Many women were reduced to exhaustion and yearned for the return of their loved ones.
Our hired man left to enlist just as corn planting commenced, so I shouldered my hoe and have worked out ever since. I guess my services are just as acceptable as his.
No conflict in history, a journalist wrote, was so much a woman's war as the Civil War. North and South, women looked for ways to help. In the North, citizens formed the Sanitary Commission and the Christian Commission to organize private relief and check the spread of disease in the Army. The disease rate was cut in half. Sanitary commissioners prowled the camps demanding they be cleaned up, reforming hospital conditions, insisting on better food, making sure blankets, shoes, medicines, and packages from home were distributed fairly. Prominent men ran the Sanitary Commission. New York lawyer George Templeton Strong was its treasurer. But hundreds of thousands of women in 7,000 local chapters all over the North did the work. Sewing, knitting, baking, wrapping bandages, raising funds, organizing rallies.
If this war developed some of the most brutal, bestial, and devilish qualities lurking in the human race, it has also shown us how much of the angel there is in the best men and women. Mary Livermore.
Mary Livermore, a Chicago minister's wife, organized Midwestern volunteers into 3,000 chapters. And when the Army was threatened with scurvy, sent so much food south that one reporter said a line of vegetables connected Chicago and Vicksburg. Clara Barton, who stood barely 5 feet tall, distributed supplies by mule train, ministered to the wounded from Cedar Mountain to Antietam, and tirelessly lobbied Washington for better care for the men. In a letter home, Catherine Wormsley, a nurse on a hospital ship, decried the confusion and chaos on board. But she ended, "Goodbye. This is life." George Templeton Strong's wife, Ellie, went south to serve on a hospital ship, too.
Ellie's tact, sense, good nature, and energy conquered the USA surgeon in charge at once. and coerced all his official dignity into hearty, grateful cooperation in the care of his cargo of 500 cases, mostly bad ones. I've never given her credit for tithe of the enterprise. Pluck, discretion, and force of character she has shown. God bless her.
We had no sanitary commission in the South. We were too poor. We had no line of rich and populous cities closely connected by rail. With us, every house was a hospital.
Southern women worked as nurses too, despite criticism that it was unladylike for them to care for ruffians. Sally Tompkins of Richmond and a staff of only 6 nursed 1,333 wounded men in her private hospital and kept all but 73 of them alive, a record unmatched by any other Civil War hospital, North or South. Mary Ann Bickerdike, a Quaker widow and sanitary commission agent, traveled with the Union Army through 4 years and 19 battles, assisting at amputations, brewing barrels of coffee, rounding up cattle and chickens and eggs to feed the grateful men who called her Mother Bickerdike. By the end of the war, General Sherman said simply, "She ranks me."
I found for my substitute a big Dutch, a boy of 20 or thereabouts, for the moderate consideration of $1,100. My alter ego could make a good soldier if he tried. Gave him my address and told him to write to me if he found himself in the hospital or in trouble, and that I would try to do what I properly could to help him. George Templeton Strong.
In July, Lincoln issued the first federal draft call. All able-bodied men between 20 and 45 were enrolled. But the law favored the well-to-do. Any man willing to pay $300 as a commutation fee or hire a substitute to serve in his place was exempt.
The law is a rich man's bill, made for him who cannot raise that sum. Senator Thaddeus Stevens.
The fathers of Theodore and Franklin Roosevelt hired substitutes. So did Andrew Carnegie and J.P. Morgan, and 2 future presidents, Chester A. Arthur and Grover Cleveland. Bounty jumping became a profession. Men signed up from one district long enough to receive a reward for enlisting, then deserted to do the same elsewhere. One man repeated the process 32 times before he was caught. Shaker Elder Frederick Evans came to see Lincoln, hoping to have his pacifist community excused from military service. "We need regiments of such men as you," Lincoln said, but granted Elder Evans' request. The Shakers were among the first conscientious objectors. On Deer Isle, 2 prominent local citizens began going house to house delivering induction notices. 149 men were called for the new draft. 42 never showed up. 33 were exempted for medical reasons. 2 paid substitutes. And one man sold his house and left his wife and several children homeless rather than desert them for the front.
For many white Northerners, the ending of slavery, also known as abolitionism, was not acceptable. Many poor Irish immigrants believed that the free blacks wanted to take their jobs, and were angry that they were being drafted to fight for the Negro's freedom. In July of 1863, at New York City, these immigrants violently reacted by torching abolitionists' houses and burning a black orphanage. Other riots occurred for the unfair practice that rich men could pay the government $300 to avoid the draft, the call to military service. The state of affairs in the North was very troubling for many, especially for President Lincoln.